The smell reached them first, before they saw the gates or the guard towers or the barbed wire, before they understood what kind of place they were approaching on that gray morning in late April 1945. It was a smell that did not belong to battlefields where Sergeant Frank O'Connor had spent the previous 11 months fighting across France and into Germany. Not the familiar stench of cordite and diesel and unwashed men that characterized combat zones, but something older and worse, something organic and sweet and rotten that made men cover their faces with whatever fabric they had and that triggered an instinct older than military training. An instinct that said whatever produced this smell was death on a scale the human mind was not equipped to process. The 45th Infantry Division had been advancing through Bavaria for weeks as Germany collapsed around them, clearing towns where white flags hung from windows and where German civilians insisted they had never supported the Nazis and had always known the war was lost, liberating displaced persons camps where Allied prisoners of war greeted them with tears and gratitude, and encountering scattered resistance from Wehrmacht units that fought briefly before surrendering or melting away into the countryside. This was the endgame of a war already won, the mopping up phase where victory was assured and where the primary challenges were logistical rather than tactical, and the soldiers approaching the complex marked on their maps as Dachau Concentration Camp expected to find another displaced persons facility, another administrative problem to be handed off to military government officers who would process refugees and arrange transportation and begin the massive task of sorting out who went where. In a continent where millions of people had been displaced by 6 years of warfare. But the smell suggested something different, and as the lead elements of the division drew closer to the camp on the morning of April 29th, moving carefully because isolated pockets of SS troops were still fighting in the area, and because nobody wanted to die in the final days of a war that everyone knew was over, other details emerged that contradicted what soldiers had been told to expect and what their experience with displaced persons camps had prepared them for. The silence was wrong. Concentration camps were supposed to be administrative facilities where political prisoners were held, places with guards shouting orders and prisoners working in organized labor details, but the complex ahead was quiet in a way that made the skin crawl, a silence that felt like the absence of something essential rather than simply the lack of noise. And then there was the train, sitting motionless on tracks that ran alongside the camp perimeter. A line of boxcars that might have been abandoned or might have been waiting for orders that would never come now that Germany was dying in the spring of 1945, and something about the stillness of those cars and the way they sat there without movement or sound made soldiers slow their approach and check their weapons and prepare for something they could not name but that every instinct said was dangerous. Lieutenant William Walsh ordered his platoon to halt 50 yards from the train while he moved forward with 2 men to investigate, because trains could carry troops or weapons or could be rigged with explosives by retreating Germans who wanted to inflict final casualties on advancing Americans, and the tactical situation required caution even though no shots had been fired and no enemy had been observed in the immediate area. They approached the first boxcar carefully, weapons ready, and when Walsh pulled open the sliding door that had been closed from the outside and latched shut, what he saw inside made him take an involuntary step backward and turn away because the human mind has limits to what it can accept without warning, limits that were exceeded in the moment when sunlight entered that boxcar and illuminated what it contained. Bodies, dozens of them, layered like cargo that had been loaded without care for humanity or dignity or any recognition that these had been people rather than things to be transported. Bodies so emaciated that bones pressed against skin that looked like parchment. Bodies in states of decomposition that indicated they had been dead for days or perhaps weeks while the train sat motionless outside the camp, and the smell that had reached the soldiers from hundreds of yards away was concentrated here to levels that made breathing difficult and that would cling to uniforms and equipment and would follow these men for the rest of their lives in moments when memory ambushed them with sensory details they thought they had forgotten. Walsh opened 3 more boxcars and found the same cargo in each, and when he returned to his platoon, he could not immediately find words to describe what he had discovered because there was no vocabulary in his experience for mass death on this scale delivered with such casual disregard for humanity. The soldiers who followed him to the train and confirmed his report were farm boys from Oklahoma and factory workers from Detroit and recent draftees who had been inducted in 1944 and rushed through training and shipped to Europe to replace casualties. Men whose experience of death had been limited to combat where soldiers died fighting or accidents where people died unluckily, and what they saw in those boxcars was death delivered systematically and industrially in quantities that suggested not battle or accident but deliberate policy implemented with bureaucratic efficiency. Some men vomited, which was not shameful but simply what bodies did when confronted with certain stimuli, and some men wept, which was not weakness but the recognition that they had encountered something outside the boundaries of what warfare was supposed to be, and some men simply went quiet in a way that their friends would later recognize as the moment something broke inside that would never be repaired. This was not a battlefield where soldiers fought soldiers and where death came with the terrible logic of armed conflict between combatants who understood the risks they accepted. And this was not a prison where criminals were held or where political dissidents were detained under conditions that might be harsh but that operated according to some recognizable framework of law or military necessity. This was something else entirely, something that existed outside the categories that American soldiers in 1945 had for understanding human behavior, and the realization that was beginning to form in the minds of men standing beside that train was that they had stumbled onto evidence of crimes that exceeded anything their training or experience or imagination had prepared them to encounter. The war they thought they had been fighting, a conventional military conflict against a conventional military enemy, was revealing itself to be something darker and more profound, and the gates to Dachau Concentration Camp stood ahead waiting to complete an education that would change every man who walked through them. Who the American soldiers were. The men of the 45th Infantry Division who approached Dachau on April 29, 1945, were not elite troops selected for special missions or soldiers who had been briefed on what concentration camps actually contained, but ordinary American servicemen whose backgrounds reflected the broad cross-section of American society that the wartime draft had mobilized for overseas service. They came from farms in the Midwest, where concentration camps were words in newspaper articles that might or might not be exaggerated propaganda, from small towns where the war was something that happened far away to other people, from cities where factory work had been the expected future before draft notices arrived and transformed civilians into infantry soldiers. Most were in their early 20s, some were teenagers who had lied about their age or looked old enough that recruiters did not ask questions, and by April 1945, the division included veterans who had fought in Sicily and Italy and France alongside replacements who had been in combat for weeks rather than months and who still carried the uncertainty that came from limited battlefield experience. What they believed about concentration camps before Dachau was shaped by fragmentary information that had filtered through military briefings and newspaper reports and rumors that circulated among troops, and the general understanding was that camps were places where the Nazis imprisoned political opponents and dissidents and people who resisted German authority, facilities that might be harsh and where conditions might be poor but that operated as prisons rather than as something fundamentally different. The word extermination appeared in some intelligence reports and in accounts from resistance fighters and escaped prisoners, but the concept of industrial-scale murder implemented through systematic bureaucratic processes was so far outside normal human experience that most soldiers simply could not conceive of what those words actually meant in practice, could not imagine that a modern European nation would construct facilities specifically designed to kill human beings in quantities that required railroad infrastructure and crematorium capacity and administrative systems to track the dead. Some soldiers had heard stories from Jewish refugees who had escaped Germany before the war, or from resistance fighters who claimed the camps were death factories, but those stories competed with other information that suggested the accounts were exaggerated, or that the truth was somewhere between Nazi propaganda that denied any mistreatment and Allied propaganda that might inflate German crimes for morale purposes. The default assumption for most American soldiers was that camps were bad but comprehensible, places where prisoners suffered under harsh conditions but where the basic framework remained recognizable as detention rather than something more sinister, and this assumption was reinforced by the fact that nothing in American experience provided reference points for understanding systematic genocide implemented as state policy with industrial efficiency. Slavery had been brutal and racist and morally indefensible, but it had been slavery rather than extermination, and even the worst atrocities in American history did not provide adequate preparation for understanding what the Nazi regime had constructed in places like Dachau. The officers commanding these soldiers were professionals who had learned their trade through officer training and combat experience, men who understood tactics and logistics and how to keep soldiers alive in combat while accomplishing assigned missions, but they had no training in how to process the discovery of mass atrocities or how to maintain discipline when soldiers confronted evidence of crimes that exceeded anything military law or the Geneva Conventions contemplated. The assumption embedded in military training was that war involved soldiers fighting soldiers, that civilians would be treated according to established laws of war, and that violations of those laws would be addressed through proper channels with appropriate investigations and punishments, but the assumption did not account for what happened when soldiers discovered that the enemy had been implementing policies so far beyond conventional war crimes that the existing framework for understanding military justice seemed inadequate to address what had been done. The 45th Infantry Division had seen combat across multiple theaters and had witnessed the usual brutalities that warfare produced. Civilians caught in crossfire, towns destroyed by artillery, soldiers on both sides who died badly. But those brutalities existed within a framework of armed conflict between military forces where civilian casualties were unfortunate but comprehensible as consequences of warfare rather than as deliberate policies. What waited beyond the gates of Dachau was different, was deliberate rather than collateral, was systematic rather than chaotic, and was implemented on a scale that suggested not the excesses of individual soldiers but the policy of a state that had devoted resources and bureaucracy and infrastructure to killing specific categories of human beings because their existence was deemed undesirable by authorities who wielded power without moral constraint. Entering Dachau, the gates to Dachau bore the inscription Arbeit macht frei. Work makes free, and the bitter irony of those words would become clear to American soldiers within minutes of entering the compound. But in the moment when the first troops passed through the entrance, what struck them most immediately was not the motto but the physical evidence of what the camp had been designed to accomplish. Guard towers stood empty now. The SS personnel who had run this facility having either fled in the final days before liberation or surrendered to American forces without the fight that military doctrine would have predicted from troops defending an important installation. And the absence of resistance created an eerie atmosphere where soldiers advanced expecting contact that never came and where the silence suggested abandonment rather than the organized operation that Dachau had been until days or perhaps hours before American arrival. The camp's layout revealed itself as soldiers moved deeper into the complex. Rows of wooden barracks arranged with geometric precision, administrative buildings where records had been maintained with bureaucratic thoroughness, facilities whose purposes were not immediately clear but whose industrial character suggested functions beyond simple detention. The ground was mud mixed with human waste where drainage had failed or had never been adequate for the number of people imprisoned here, and everywhere was the smell that soldiers had detected from hundreds of yards away, the smell of death and disease and human degradation on a scale that overwhelmed the senses and made clear that whatever had happened here had involved numbers that exceeded anything concentration camp was supposed to mean. And then there were the prisoners, and this was the image that would stay with soldiers for the rest of their lives, that would appear in nightmares and quiet moments and would make some men unable to speak about Dachau even decades later when children asked what they had done in the war. They emerged from barracks slowly, moving with the careful deliberation of people whose bodies had been pushed past normal limits of endurance, and their appearance was so shocking that some soldiers initially could not process that these were living human beings rather than corpses that somehow retained animation. Skin stretched over bones with almost no fat or muscle remaining, eyes sunken deep into skulls, bodies so emaciated that the basic shape of human form was distorted into something that looked like medical illustrations of anatomy rather than living people, and the expressions on faces that watched American soldiers. With emotions that mixed hope and disbelief and the caution that came from years of learning that any change might be for the worse rather than better. The silence was profound, because prisoners who had learned that noise brought punishment and that survival depended on invisibility did not immediately celebrate or cheer or show the kind of reaction that American soldiers expected when they liberated Allied prisoners of war or displaced persons who greeted them with tears and gratitude and relief. Instead, the prisoners watched, waiting to see if this was real or another trick, waiting to confirm that these were actually Americans and that liberation was genuine rather than a momentary hope that would be crushed when circumstances changed. And the wariness in their eyes reflected years of experience that had taught them trust was dangerous and that survival meant assuming the worst until proven otherwise. Some soldiers tried to offer rations, which was instinct and kindness but which would prove dangerous because bodies that had been starved for months or years could not process rich American military rations without medical supervision, and prisoners who ate too much too quickly would die from refeeding syndrome that their liberators did not understand and could not prevent through good intentions alone. Other soldiers simply stood and stared, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what human beings were supposed to look like, trying to understand how people could reach this condition and still be alive, and the gap between expectation and reality was so wide that minds struggled to process the information their eyes provided. The camp had been designed to hold perhaps 6,000 prisoners under the conditions that international law suggested concentration camps should maintain. But by April 1945, more than 30,000 people were imprisoned here in conditions that made survival itself an accomplishment that defied medical explanation. Typhus and tuberculosis and dysentery killed daily. Bodies were stacked in areas where crematorium capacity had been exceeded, and the infrastructure of the camp had collapsed under numbers it was never designed to handle even if the SS had been interested in prisoner welfare, which they demonstrably were not based on the conditions that American soldiers were documenting with photographs and written reports that would become evidence in war crimes trials. Officers attempted to organize relief efforts immediately, calling for medical personnel and supplies and trying to establish some framework for addressing humanitarian crisis that exceeded anything military medicine was equipped to handle. But the scale of need was overwhelming and the priorities were unclear because every prisoner needed immediate help and resources were finite, and deciding who received treatment first meant accepting that some would die while waiting. The liberation of Dachau was supposed to be a victory, a moment of moral clarity where American forces freed innocent people from Nazi tyranny, but the reality was chaos and death, and the recognition that opening the gates did not undo what years of imprisonment had done to bodies and minds that had been systematically destroyed by policies designed to kill through neglect and cruelty, and the deliberate withholding of food and medicine and basic human dignity. The train that broke Monttrain, that sat outside Dachau's perimeter, became the focal point for rage that had been building since American soldiers first smelled death approaching the camp, and that intensified with every detail discovered inside the compound. And if there was a single moment when discipline began to fracture, and when the rules that governed military conduct started to break down, it was when soldiers who had walked through the barracks and seen the living prisoners returned to examine more carefully the boxcars that contained the dead. The initial discovery had been shocking but abstract, bodies glimpsed briefly in dim light filtered through boxcar doors, but systematic examination revealed details that transformed shock into fury, and that made clear this was not collateral damage from warfare but murder implemented with bureaucratic precision and casual disregard for human life. The boxcars contained more than 2,000 bodies, prisoners who had been loaded onto the train at camps that were being evacuated as Soviet and American forces advanced, and who had died during transport when the train was shunted onto sidings and forgotten, when water and food were not provided, when people died of thirst and starvation and disease while the train sat motionless and guards prevented anyone from leaving or from receiving help. Some prisoners had died days earlier and bodies showed advanced decomposition. Others had died more recently and might have been saved if the train had been discovered hours sooner. And the randomness of who lived and who died based on arbitrary timing made the deaths seem even more cruel and pointless than if they had resulted from some comprehensible military necessity. Soldiers who examined the train carefully found evidence that prisoners had tried to escape or had begged for water or had simply endured in silence as people around them died, and the suffering that those boxcars contained was suffering that served no military purpose and accomplished no strategic objective but existed solely because Nazi authorities had decided that certain categories of human beings could be transported like cargo, and that whether they survived the journey was irrelevant to the logistics of moving them from one location to another. The realization that this was policy rather than accident, that trains full of dying people were part of a system that operated according to schedules and bureaucratic procedures, made the crime seem even worse than if it had been random violence by individual soldiers acting without orders. The psychological impact on American soldiers who examined that train was immediate and profound, and officers who tried to maintain discipline noted that men who had fought through France and into Germany without breaking, who had seen friends killed in combat and who had killed enemy soldiers themselves, were reduced to tears or rage by what they found in those boxcars. The death they had experienced in combat was death between armed combatants who understood the risks they accepted, death that came with the terrible logic of warfare where soldiers fought and sometimes died. But the death in those boxcars was death delivered to people who could not fight back and who had no way to resist and whose only crime was being categorized as undesirable by a regime that wielded power without moral restraint. Some soldiers walked away from the train and refused to discuss what they had seen, beginning the silence that would characterize many Dachau veterans for the rest of their lives, the refusal to speak about experiences that were too dark to share with people who had not been there and who could not understand what it meant to witness evidence of systematic murder on industrial scale. Other soldiers responded with anger that looked for targets and that would, in the hours that followed, find those targets among the SS guards who had been captured when American forces arrived and who now stood in groups waiting to be processed as prisoners of war according to the Geneva Conventions that they had violated so completely that applying those same protections to them seemed like moral failure. The SS guards, the SS personnel who had run Dachau, did not fight to defend the camp when American forces arrived, which was tactically rational because resistance would have been brief and futile against superior American firepower, but which created a situation where guards who had implemented policies of systematic cruelty and murder now expected to be treated as ordinary prisoners of war entitled to protections under international law. Some guards had fled in the days before liberation when it became clear that American forces would reach Dachau and that remaining meant capture, but others stayed either because they believed they would be protected by their status as military personnel or because fleeing was logistically difficult or simply because they did not understand that what they had done might be treated as criminal rather than as following orders in time of war. The guards who surrendered presented themselves as soldiers who had performed assigned duties, who had followed orders from superior officers, and who expected the same treatment that Wehrmacht soldiers received when they surrendered to American forces, but the prisoners who had survived Dachau identified specific guards as having been particularly brutal or as having been directly responsible for killings or torture or selections that sent prisoners to death. The American soldiers who processed these surrendering guards were caught between military protocol that said prisoners should be disarmed and secured and sent to rear areas for formal processing, and rage that said these men deserved immediate punishment for crimes that exceeded anything that military justice was designed to address. The demeanor of SS guards varied from defiant to fearful to confused, with some insisting they had only followed orders and had no personal responsibility for camp policies, others claiming they had been assigned to Dachau recently and had not participated in the worst abuses, and a few remaining silent in recognition that nothing they could say would change how they would be perceived by American soldiers who had just walked through barracks full of dying prisoners and examined boxcars full of corpses. The guards were not elderly men or boys who had been conscripted late in the war but adult men who had volunteered for SS service and who had been selected for camp duty, and their physical condition, well-fed and healthy compared to the skeletal prisoners, made the contrast between jailers and imprisoned viscerally obvious in ways that intensified American anger. Officers attempted to establish procedures for securing prisoners and maintaining custody until formal war crimes investigations could begin. But the situation was complicated by chaos and by the fact that normal chains of command were strained by rapid advance across Germany and by the unexpected discovery of Dachau's true nature. Some guards were separated from the main group and moved to secure locations, but others remained in areas where American soldiers and liberated prisoners had access to them, and the combination of rage and opportunity and absence of clear authority created conditions where violence became possible, and where the discipline that normally governed American military operations began to erode under pressures that training had not prepared officers or enlisted men to handle. The moment discipline failed. The killings began in confusion rather than through organized decision, when individual soldiers or small groups responded to specific provocations or to the cumulative weight of what they had seen in the camp and on the train, and escalated in the absence of officers who might have prevented the first acts and thereby prevented the momentum that made subsequent acts easier. Some SS guards were shot while attempting to flee or while allegedly reaching for weapons, justifications that might have been legitimate or might have been pretexts for executions that soldiers wanted to conduct regardless of whether actual threats existed. Other guards were killed in circumstances that were clearly executions rather than combat, lined against walls or shot in groups after being disarmed and secured, and these killings violated the laws of war and military justice regardless of what crimes the guards had committed or what moral arguments might be made about deserving death. The breakdown of discipline was not universal. Many American soldiers maintained their professional composure and followed orders and treated SS guards according to military protocol even while feeling rage about what those guards had done. But the breakdown was significant enough that dozens of SS personnel died in circumstances that were later investigated as potential war crimes committed by American forces. Some officers attempted to stop the killings when they became aware of what was happening, ordering soldiers to cease fire and to secure remaining prisoners according to proper procedures, but other officers looked away or did not intervene immediately or gave orders that were ambiguous enough to allow soldiers to interpret them as permission to continue. The participation of liberated prisoners in some killings complicated the moral and legal questions, because prisoners who had survived years of brutality took opportunities to attack guards when American control was not yet established, and some American soldiers stepped aside to allow that revenge or actively facilitated it by providing weapons or by not intervening when they could have prevented prisoner violence against guards. The line between justice and revenge, between legitimate response to crimes and criminal behavior by those claiming to be liberators, became blurred in ways that would trouble some veterans for the rest of their lives and that would lead to questions about whether Americans had compromised their moral authority by responding to Nazi crimes with crimes of their own. The best estimates suggest that somewhere between 30 and 50 SS guards died in circumstances that were executions rather than combat, though exact numbers were never definitively established because chaos and the rapid movement of military units made investigation difficult, and because there was limited institutional interest in prosecuting American soldiers for killing concentration camp guards even if those killings violated military law. The investigations that did occur were limited and resulted in few formal charges, partly because evidence was difficult to gather after the fact and partly because commanders recognized that prosecuting soldiers who had been psychologically traumatized by discovering Dachau would be difficult to justify to American public opinion that viewed concentration camp guards as deserving whatever treatment they received. The moment when discipline failed was brief, measured in hours rather than days, and was contained by officers who reasserted control and by soldiers who recognized that continued killing would make them complicit in the kind of lawlessness they were supposed to be fighting against. But the moment mattered because it demonstrated that even professional military forces operating under established rules of war could break when confronted with moral extremes that exceeded anything their training had prepared them to handle, that civilization was thin and fragile and could erode quickly under sufficient pressure, and that the difference between soldiers and war criminals could sometimes be measured in split-second decisions made under conditions of extreme stress and rage. Officers, orders, and aftermath. The immediate response from American command when reports reached higher headquarters about killings of SS guards at Dachau was investigation to determine what had happened and whether violations of military law had occurred that required formal charges against soldiers or officers who had participated in or allowed the executions. Lieutenant General Alexander Patch, commanding the 7th Army, ordered a preliminary investigation within days of the liberation, and subsequent inquiries attempted to establish timelines and identify individuals who had been involved in killing prisoners who had surrendered and who should have been protected under the laws of war regardless of what crimes they themselves had committed. The investigations revealed that discipline had broken down for a brief period, that some killings were clearly executions rather than combat actions, and that both enlisted soldiers and some officers had participated in or failed to prevent actions that violated military regulations and the Geneva Conventions. But the investigations also revealed the context in which those actions occurred. Soldiers discovering thousands of dying prisoners, examining boxcars full of corpses, confronting evidence of systematic murder on industrial scale, and the conclusion reached by most investigating officers was that while violations had occurred, prosecution would be difficult and would require explaining to American public and to military justice system why soldiers who had just liberated a death camp should face courts-martial for killing the guards who had run that camp. The decision made at command level was to document what had happened but to pursue limited disciplinary action, which meant that some officers received reprimands or were transferred to different assignments but that no soldiers faced formal courts-martial for killing SS guards at Dachau. The rationale was partly practical. Evidence was incomplete and witnesses were scattered across advancing military units, but partly reflected recognition that putting soldiers on trial for executing concentration camp guards would be legally correct but morally complicated and politically difficult at a moment when American public was just beginning to learn the full truth about Nazi camps and when sympathy for SS guards was essentially non-existent. The outcome troubled some observers who argued that America had compromised its moral standing by allowing war crimes to go unpunished even when those crimes were committed by American forces, and the argument had merit because the rule of law requires application even when subjects are unsympathetic and even when crimes occurred in response to other crimes that were objectively worse. But the counterargument was that requiring soldiers who had been traumatized by discovering mass atrocities to face legal consequences for actions taken in immediate aftermath of that discovery was punishment that exceeded what justice required and that ignored the psychological realities of what those soldiers had experienced in the hours before discipline broke down. The compromise that emerged was acknowledgement that violations had occurred, documentation in official records that would be available to historians and to anyone who wanted to understand the complete truth about Dachau's liberation, but limited formal punishment for soldiers whose actions reflected human limits under conditions of extreme moral stress rather than criminal intent or pattern of abuse. The approach satisfied neither those who believed all violations must be prosecuted nor those who believed soldiers who killed SS guards deserved no punishment whatsoever, but it reflected the messy reality that moral absolutes are difficult to apply in situations where every option involves compromising some principle or value that seems important. The psychological cost. The men who liberated Dachau carried what they had seen for the rest of their lives, and the burden manifested in nightmares and silences and behaviors that families struggled to understand and that veterans struggled to explain to people who had not been there and who could not comprehend what it meant to walk through gates and discover industrial-scale murder implemented with bureaucratic precision. Some veterans developed what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, Though in 1945 the condition was not well understood and treatment options were limited to time and alcohol, and the hope that memories would fade with distance from events that had caused them. The nightmares were common and persistent, dreams that replayed discoveries made in barracks or train cars. Dreams where the dead remained dead but the memories remained vivid, and veterans learned to live with interrupted sleep and with the understanding that certain triggers, smells or sounds or images, would bring back sensory memories of Dachau with clarity that made the past feel more real than the present. Some men drank to manage the memories, developing alcoholism that would destroy marriages and careers and health, and some withdrew from social connection because explaining what they had experienced felt impossible, and because the gap between their internal reality and the peaceful civilian world they returned to seemed unbridgeable. The silence that characterized many Dachau veterans was not about shame or about believing they had done something wrong, but about protection. Protecting themselves from having to relive experiences by talking about them, protecting families from knowledge that would burden them without providing understanding, and protecting a version of themselves that existed before Dachau, and that they wanted to preserve even though they knew that version had been permanently altered by what they witnessed. Children would ask what their fathers had done in the war and would receive answers that focused on battles fought or places traveled. And only years later would some veterans begin to speak about Dachau when they decided that silence was allowing history to be forgotten or distorted, and that testimony from witnesses mattered even when that testimony was painful to provide. The reflections that veterans shared years or decades after liberation often focused less on the horror of what they found than on questions about humanity and civilization that the discovery raised. Questions about how modern European nation with educational system and cultural achievements and scientific advancement could implement policies of systematic murder. Questions about whether the capacity for such evil existed in all societies under certain conditions or whether Germany represented a unique historical aberration, and questions about their own responses and whether they had maintained their humanity or had compromised it in the hours when discipline failed and when some SS guards died in circumstances that were executions rather than justice. Some veterans found meaning in testimony, speaking at schools or to historians or at memorial events, believing that bearing witness was a responsibility they owed to prisoners who had died, and to future generations who needed to understand that the Holocaust was not myth or exaggeration, but documented historical reality that thousands of American soldiers had witnessed directly. Other veterans never spoke publicly but carried their memories privately, believing that some experiences were too dark to share or that their role had been simply to be present at a moment in history, and that speaking about it would not add value beyond what photographs and official records already documented. The psychological cost was not limited to soldiers who had participated in killing SS guards or who struggled with moral questions about their own behavior, but extended to men whose conduct had been entirely professional and who had maintained discipline throughout but who still carried the weight of having witnessed human suffering on scale that exceeded normal psychological capacity to process. The burden was democratic in distribution, affecting veterans regardless of rank or role or individual actions, because simply being present at Dachau and seeing what the camp contained was enough to create trauma that would last lifetimes. Liberation is not victory. The opening of Dachau's gates on April 29, 1945, was officially recorded as liberation, but for the 30,000 prisoners who had survived to see American soldiers arrive, liberation was the beginning of a long process rather than an endpoint, and for many, the process would end in death despite the best efforts of American medical personnel, who struggled to save people whose bodies had been pushed past the limits of what medical science could repair. The immediate crisis was medical. Typhus and tuberculosis and dysentery killed daily. Starvation had damaged organs in ways that could not be reversed quickly, and the refeeding syndrome that killed prisoners who ate too much too quickly was a threat that military doctors learned to manage only after initial deaths taught them that good intentions required careful medical protocol. The field hospitals that were established near Dachau became intensive care facilities where doctors and nurses worked to save patients whose conditions would have been considered hopeless under normal circumstances, and the death rate in the weeks following liberation remained high as bodies that had survived months or years of deliberate starvation and disease succumbed to damage that could not be undone through adequate food and clean water and medical treatment alone. Some prisoners who had been days from death when Americans arrived were saved through aggressive medical intervention, but others who seemed stable enough to survive died from complications that developed days or weeks after liberation when it seemed they should have been past the crisis point. The psychological state of survivors was complex and varied, with some experiencing immediate relief and gratitude, others remaining emotionally numb in ways that suggested profound trauma, and many displaying wariness that reflected years of learning that hope was dangerous, and that trusting apparent improvements in conditions might lead to disappointment or worse. The liberation did not erase memories of what prisoners had experienced or witnessed, did not bring back family members who had died or been killed, and did not immediately restore the sense of safety and normalcy that psychological recovery required, and many survivors would struggle for years or decades with trauma that manifested in nightmares and depression and difficulty forming human connections after years of seeing how easily humans could be degraded and destroyed. The freedom that liberation supposedly brought was limited by practical realities that made immediate departure from Dachau impossible for most prisoners. They had nowhere to go because homes had been destroyed or occupied, families had been killed or scattered across Europe, and physical condition made travel dangerous or impossible without medical supervision. The displaced persons camps that were established to house survivors became transitional spaces where people waited months or years for immigration paperwork or for family reunification or for enough physical recovery to allow resettlement. And the camps were improvement over Dachau but were still institutional settings that restricted freedom and that reminded survivors daily that liberation had not restored the lives they had before imprisonment. The narratives that developed around Dachau's liberation often emphasized the moment American soldiers arrived and opened the gates, treating that moment as the climax of a story that ended with freedom and implied future happiness. But the reality for survivors was that liberation was a necessary but insufficient condition for recovery, that opening gates did not undo years of trauma or restore physical health or bring back the dead or answer questions about how to rebuild lives in a world that had been fundamentally altered by 6 years of war and genocide. The victory that Dachau's liberation represented was real and important. It ended the killing and suffering that the camp inflicted, but it was not the clean ending that narratives of good triumphing over evil typically required, and the messy aftermath where people struggled to survive freedom was less satisfying than the dramatic moment of gates opening, but was equally important to understanding what liberation actually meant. What Dachau revealed. The liberation of Dachau on April 29, 1945, revealed truths that would reshape how Americans understood World War II and how they thought about human capacity for evil and about the fragility of civilization that could produce both remarkable achievement and systematic genocide within the same society. The American soldiers who walked through those gates expecting to find a prisoner of war camp or political detention facility discovered instead evidence of crimes that exceeded their ability to comprehend, and their testimony, documented in photographs and written reports and later in oral histories, would become part of the historical record that made Holocaust denial impossible for anyone engaging honestly with evidence. But Dachau also revealed truths about the liberators themselves, about how ordinary American soldiers who believed they were fighting a conventional military war responded when they discovered they had been fighting against something more profound than conventional military threat, and about the limits of discipline and training when human beings confront moral extremes that exceed anything their experience has prepared them to process. The breakdown of discipline that led to killings of SS guards lasted only hours and affected only some soldiers, but it demonstrated that civilization and restraint are fragile achievements that can erode quickly under sufficient pressure, that the difference between soldiers following rules of war and soldiers committing war crimes can be measured in moments of lost control under extreme stress, and that moral certainty about how one would behave in extreme circumstances is often contradicted by how people actually behave when those circumstances occur. The investigations that followed liberation documented both the crimes committed by SS personnel who ran Dachau and the violations committed by some American soldiers who killed prisoners who had surrendered, and the decision to pursue limited prosecution of Americans while vigorously prosecuting Germans reflected pragmatic recognition that moral equivalence was false. What SS guards had done systematically over years was categorically different from what American soldiers did in hours of rage and trauma, but also reflected awareness that perfect justice was impossible, and that the messy reality of human behavior under extreme conditions did not fit neatly into categories of right and wrong that peacetime ethics assumed. The legacy that Dachau left for veterans who had been present at liberation was burden of knowledge that could not be shared easily with people who had not been there, burden of memories that would intrude for decades in moments when triggers would transport them back to April 1945 and make the past more vivid than the present, and burden of questions about humanity and civilization and their own behavior that had no satisfying answers but that demanded contemplation anyway. Some veterans found ways to carry that burden through testimony and education and determination to ensure that what they had witnessed would not be forgotten or denied, while others carried it in silence and hoped that time would dull the sharpness of memories that remained painfully clear even as other details of the war faded into general impressions. Dachau was liberated in a day, but what it did to the men who walked through its gates lasted a lifetime. The physical camp was eventually closed and became a memorial site where visitors could learn about what had happened there. But the psychological camp remained open in the minds of veterans who carried memories that could not be contained or processed through normal therapeutic means, and that would remain vivid until death finally released them from obligation to remember what they wished they could forget but knew they must never deny or minimize or allow others to misunderstand.